Okay, so this is a video response to The Legend of Leo. Now, he didn't ask for a video response, but I decided to do one anyways because this is a topic that I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to be doing it off the cuff, so let's get straight to it. And the topic is basically the worst things about your favourite games, which he did for a lot of his favourite games. Now, I could talk about my top 10 favourite games, but you already know them, and there's a lot of games that I like, so I want to bring up a lot more of my favourite games so that I've got more to talk about. But the result of this is that I'm going to have a lot of games to talk about, so I don't want to have to record footage for each and every single one of these games. Do bear that in mind. So yeah, some of the games aren't going to be represented by footage because I can't capture the footage, so I'm just going to be brief with each and every single one of them. It's not going to be a well-made video like Leo's, so just bear that in mind. Anyways, let's get this done. First of all, we have Onimusha Dawn of Dreams. Now, the worst thing about Dawn of Dreams, well, the worst things, are the removal of charge attacks, and the fact that all the added flexibility is mostly meaningless. That, and it's very grindy. So basically, the charge attacks were from Onimusha 2 and 3, they were also in Genma, and it was basically where you could wait for a while and your attacks would charge up and strengthen, and it would change the properties to add knockback. That was removed in Dawn of Dreams, and they replaced it with like new combat abilities, which aren't as useful in my opinion. They are cool that they're there, and they may look cool to look at with some characters, but in terms of utility, they're not as useful and they're not as consistent in terms of like value. Like some of them are really useful, but some of them are not so useful. So they're not very consistent in terms of usefulness. Next problem is that it's a bit grindy, as I say, as bosses tend to have a lot of health, and if you don't grind, you'll be hitting bosses for a long time. It's not really built around the fact that there's not really a concrete leveling system in the previous games, because this game does have a leveling system. So you have to bear that in mind, and that might mean that you have to grind a bit to stand a chance against some of the enemies, because if you don't grind, then you're going to have a hard time in this game. Now, the next game I want to talk about is Growan Heritage of War. I've already reviewed this game, so I've already mentioned the problem with this game, and that is some of the missions are frustrating and don't explain the mission complete criteria. And this can be a real pain, so you have to bring up a guide just to find out what the mission complete criteria is. And one mission in particular, the mission complete criteria is completely unknown. Nobody knows. And even I don't know, so I never did it. But I did use a guide to get mission complete on every other mission in the game because I just wanted to, because I just wanted that extra challenge. But the fact that you don't know the criteria is a pain in the ass, and the fact that some of the missions can be frustrating is also a bit annoying too. Next I want to talk about Tales of Symphonia, which is a game that Leo mentioned on his list. It's also going to be on mine as well. Like, basically my problem with Tales of Symphonia is the annoying puzzles and dungeons. Like, I don't like puzzles in video games, I never have liked puzzles in video games, and Tales of Symphonia has some really annoying ones, particularly in the sewers and in the Temple of Shadow. Those dungeons are an absolute bloody nightmare, and I dread them on every playthrough. Next up, we have Castlevania Symphony of the Night. As I say, this game is fun to play, but it does have one caveat, and that's the fact that it's very easily broken. Though I don't see that as a downside personally, but I can see why some people would. Like, it's one of those games that starts out a bit difficult, but once you unlock certain abilities, it just gets super easy. And really, it's not necessarily abilities, but just certain pieces of equipment that can just be abused, like the shield rod and the chrysogrim, for example. And yeah, those are the most broken pieces of equipment in the game, and yeah, you can break the game pretty easily with that, essentially nullifying the challenge. The next game is Need for Speed Carbon. The game is way too short. Like, you can beat it in like 4 hours probably, and also the crew members can be kind of annoying, as you may have seen if you watched my 200 subscriber special. You'll have seen Neville diving into me while I'm trying to take a shortcut. So yeah, that's the biggest problem with Need for Speed Carbon. Next up we have Midnight Club 3, which has way too much traffic on the road, and that can be a bit annoying because you end up crashing into traffic cars a lot, and also races can get a bit frustrating at times. Not as frustrating as Midnight Club 2, but frustrating nonetheless. The next one is Super Smash Bros. Melee, and really the main problem I have with that game is the competitive community. I fucking hate the competitive community of Smash Bros. Melee. Like, I was Once involved in the community, it was a Smash community, and yeah, those people were just dickheads. Like, I just really don't like the community at all. I fucking hate the Smash Bros. Community, and it kind of ruined the series for me. I just lost interest in the series because of that. That and the fact that I lost interest in Nintendo in general. But yeah, Smash Bros. Melee, the community just really soured me on it. Next up we have Shadow Hearts, and this is one particular point in the game, and there's a dungeon, I've forgotten the exact name of it, but it's basically this temple where you have to go through the cave systems within the dungeon, and you have to basically do it multiple times with multiple characters, if I recall. And basically what it does is it seals some of your commands, and on the final run through you only have the attack command, and that's it. You can't defend, you can't do anything except attack, which is really annoying. And right after that you have to fight a boss that can wipe your entire party in one hit if you don't have a certain accessory equipped, which is also very annoying. Next game we have is Pokemon Yellow, and the biggest problem with that is, well, it's aged pretty badly because it lacks the quality of life improvements that Gen 2 brought to the table, like the ability to access HM abilities by pressing A in front of the thing you want to use it on. But in Pokemon Yellow you have to open up the menu and find the HM move on the Pokemon in the pie menu, and then you have to select it when you're stood next to the thing you want to use it. It's a bit of a pain. That and the fact that it's poorly programmed, which you can tell because of the missing no glitch, because it's basically based on like a programming issue in the game. I don't want to go in too much detail into it, but yeah, it's definitely a bit of a bodge in the programming department, and yeah, that's one of the problems with it. It's a fun game, but it's definitely not aged brilliantly. Star Fox Assault is the next game, and the biggest problem with that game is the same problem with Need for Speed Carbon. The game is too short. That and the on-foot controls aren't exactly ideal. I mean, it's not that big of a deal for me personally, I could get past that, but it is still a problem with the game. And yeah, it is a bit too short. You don't have like the multiple paths of the other Star Fox games for replay value, so yeah, that's another downside, but I still love the game. Next up, I want to talk about both Super Mario Sunshine and Galaxy because they have the same problem, and that's some of the platforming sections can get a bit frustrating. More so in Sunshine than Galaxy, but even Galaxy has some really frustrating ones. I'm not big into platform people, so when frustrating sections come up, it gets really annoying for me. But yeah, other than that, I didn't mind those games. Next we have Pokemon XD. The biggest problem with that game is mainly the fact that it reuses a lot of Colosseum's assets. Like, most of the game is basically just Colosseum again, except the main character isn't as cool as Colosseum's main character, so yeah, that's the biggest problem with XD. I mean, it makes some improvements on the Colosseum, but at the same time, it just reuses a lot of Colosseum stuff. So it's more of the same, but with a few improvements, but with a less interesting main character. Next we have Kirby Superstar, and the main complaint I have with Kirby Superstar is the items that you collect in the Great Cave Offensive are nothing more than bragging rights rewards. They don't do anything, they're just there to look at. And Castle Lolo was cut out of Spring Breeze from the first game, which is a bit of a shame. Next we have Kirby Air Ride. Some stars are just terrible, like the Slick Star for example. That star is absolutely terrible, like it's just shitting everywhere. Why would you put it in the game? Like, as a handicap or something? I don't know. But it's a pretty big handicap because it absolutely sucks. It's shit. The next game I want to talk about is Star Ocean 1. Now, I also want to talk about 2 as well, but I'll start with 1. The second planet felt rushed. I mean, it literally just skips you to the final dungeon. The remake adds a little bit more to it, but it still feels a bit cut short. And also the fact that you have to use a cursor to move your character in battle, which was changed in later games because you could actually move freely by just using the D-pad. You can't do that in the original Star Ocean. Speaking of Star Ocean, next up we have Star Ocean 2, and the biggest problem with Star Ocean 2, and this can be applied to Star Ocean 1 as well, and that's navigating the menu is a bloody nightmare because there's so many items that you have, and this is a game where you use a lot of items in battle, and you have to navigate a menu which only like shows like a column of like 2 at a time with like 2 rows. It's not good, and yeah, it's a real pain to actually find items, and I don't even think that you can organize them for battle, even though you can organize them in the actual menu. Like when you're actually looking for an item in battle, it's very hard. And the other problem with Star Ocean 2 exclusively is the fact that Disc 1's story is mostly just about getting sidetracked and has nothing to do with like the main goal of the story, because you're constantly getting sidetracked, and it means that the story isn't really going anywhere for most of Disc 1, which is probably why the Star Ocean anime is basically just Disc 1, because it was trying to have all these sections that don't really have like a cohesive plot, so they thought, we'll just make some silly nonsense out of like Disc 1, and then Disc 2 happened and they're like, we don't really want to make Disc 2, the story's too involving and complicated. But yeah, it made for a good anime opportunity, did Disc 1 story, but for a game it kind of gets a bit of a slog, because the anime kind of like goes more into it, even though the anime isn't necessarily good. But yeah, like Disc 1 story is just mostly getting sidetracked, and that's the biggest problem with Star Ocean 2 for me. Like, it does get a little bit better in the second half, but by that point you're on Disc 2 very quickly, and yeah, that basically sums it up. And the ARMS tournament, man, it's the most memorable part of the game, because it just goes on for way too long. Like, when you play it for the first time on your first playthrough, the ARMS tournament is pretty cool, but when you see the ARMS tournament again and again and again and again, it's always the part that you dread getting through, because it just goes on forever. And yeah, like, you have to go through that to get access to characters like Oprah and stuff, and like the more interesting parts of the game in Disc 1. So yeah, next game we have is Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. Now, the biggest problem with this game is the final dungeon. It's way too long, like way too long, and it can also be an annoying dungeon as well. So yeah, that's my biggest problem. That and the backtracking near the end of the game is not really ideal. So yeah. The next game I will talk about is Pokemon Colosseum. Now, the biggest flaw of this game is the fact that there's only 48 Pokemon, there's no wild Pokemon, and well, it has the outdated round turn-based combat system that a lot of people won't understand what I'm talking about. If you watch my video on Atelier Sophie, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It has that same combat system as Atelier Sophie, where there's a speed stat that dictates whether the enemy or you goes first, and like which character goes first and all of that, and you can't tell until you've inputted the command who attacks first, which is really frustrating, and having to select the command for both of your Pokemon, and this is an issue with a lot of JRPGs, by the way, not just Colosseum, having to input your commands for both Pokemon when there's just one Pokemon left on the enemy team that has like 1 HP, and you just want to attack with one Pokemon, but you still have to input the command for the other Pokemon. Yeah, that's annoying, and it's a problem in so many old school JRPGs, not just Pokemon Colosseum, and it's something that I just can't put up with nowadays. But I let it slide just for Pokemon Colosseum, because it's a game that I played in my childhood that I'm very fond of. And it also reuses assets from Stadium 2. Not a big issue for me, but it is worth mentioning nonetheless. The next game I want to mention is Infinite Discovery. Now, the biggest problem with Infinite Discovery for me personally is the traps. There are traps in this game, but most of them are in treasure chests, and there's also traps in Castle Trevor, which I don't like. The combat is pretty shallow, as there's not that many moves that you can do. There's a few, but not too many, and most of it is just spamming Green Velocity over and over and over again, so it's not that interesting. There's only one controllable character, so if you thought about like controlling different characters to like change things up, sadly you can't. You can only control the main character, Capel, which is kind of sad that you can only control that character for the whole game, but it is what it is. And the menu doesn't pause the game, so when you enter the menu during combat, you're getting attacked while you're trying to go into the menu to use your healing potions, and it's just an absolute nightmare. Like, who thought that was a good idea? Like, seriously. Anyways, the next game is Castlevania Curse of Darkness. Now, I mentioned this in my review of the game on my website. The movement speed is too slow. Like, you have to dodge constantly just to speed yourself up, but you have to do it in a rhythm, because otherwise the recovery frames will make you just as slow as you would be if you just moved normally. So yeah, you kind of have to get a rhythm going with the dodge just to speed yourself up, because otherwise it will take forever to get from one area to the other. Speaking of areas, well, they look kind of samey, and that can be a problem because it can make it difficult to navigate at times unless you're using the map all the time, because all the rooms look the same in a lot of the areas, which is pretty problematic in this game. Not to mention some of the corridors are pretty long when you consider the fact that you're moving very slow. And the next problem is the stealing. Like, the stealing can be pretty annoying at times, it really can be. If you want to steal every item, and some items can only be acquired by stealing, and there's like one chance to acquire them, and that's it, unless you do the boss rush and get through all the bosses and successfully steal from each and every one of them while beating them in the boss rush. Yeah, it's not ideal to do it that way, so yeah, you want to steal everything, but at the same time, it's very frustrating to do so. The next game I want to talk about is Baton Kaitos. And the biggest problem with Baton Kaitos is that there's no AoE attacks in battle, and because of the nature of it being like a card-based battle system, there's a bit of randomness there, which can be a bit of a pain at times. There's some difficulty spikes in the game, significant ones, and battles can feel a bit slow, and also the story takes a while to pick up. It's a bit like something I'm going to mention in a later game. You'll probably already know what that game is, but yeah, like that's a problem in this game as well. Next is Onimusha 3, and the biggest problem with Onimusha 3 is that it removed a lot of content from 2. Like, it removed the secret text, it removed the gifting system, and you know, all of that stuff, and the replacement for it was like the 10-point slash, which I wasn't keen on. I prefer the secret text. I know it might not seem like too much, but like the fact that I removed that stuff, like, I wasn't keen on it. But yeah, other than that, it's very much unchanged from 2 of them. The fact that they removed tank controls and they made chain ascents easier to pull off, which yeah, like I do think that's a cool thing, and definitely is an improvement from 2, but I can't ignore the fact that they removed some features from 2. Speaking of Onimusha 2, let's talk about Onimusha 2's problems, and the biggest problem with Onimusha 2 is tank controls, though I don't think they're that annoying in this game. Like, I don't think they're as annoying as like God Hand, for example, but it can be considered annoying for some people, but I think because of like the focus button, it's not as bad, although it can feel a bit wonky when you're like facing a direction and like the camera's in one direction, but you have to move where you're facing, not from where the camera's facing, and that can be a bit awkward at times. But once you get over that, it's not that bad. You cannot trigger only for manually, so it's a bit like Painkiller when you get Demon Morph after 66 souls, and then you just like transform into a demon, and you can't really control that, although in Painkiller you do have a card in Battle Out of Hell that lets you trigger it manually. Bosses aren't really the best in Onimusha 2. I'm not really a fan of most of them. There is one boss that I do like in the game. Well, there's actually 2, but most of the bosses kind of suck, just gonna be honest. And the next game is Kirby's Adventure Wii, and my issue with this game is mainly the fact that it's a downgraded version of the cancelled GameCube game. Like, the cancelled GameCube game looks so cool, as you could play as the enemies and you could like stack all of your characters on top of each other, and like it was so cool. And then it's like they made this and you can only play as like Meta Knight, DDD and Level D, which is a bit of a shame. And also I don't think that the levels are as memorable as previous games personally, and I could say the same about a lot of the newer Kirby games. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but like the older Kirby games, the classics, I remember the levels more than modern Kirby games. I just don't remember the levels as much, they're just not as memorable to me. That's not to say that they're bad, it's just that I just don't find them memorable. That's just me personally, but yeah. Anyways, the next game I want to talk about is Star Fox, and I'm talking about the Super Nintendo version. And the biggest problem with Star Fox is the fact that there's way too much debris to crash into, and the game relies on this to kind of screw you a lot of the time. That and the fact that you move really slowly and there's no charge shot, which is a bit of a shame. The next game I want to talk about is Star Ocean 6. I already mentioned this in my review, so I'm just going to get straight to the point. AI is brain dead, there's a few glitches, a SOA is easily broke, and the private action indicator from 5 was removed. I mentioned it in my review, don't need to mention it again, but I just did today. East 4, now this includes Dawn of East and Celceta. Now, Dawn of East has a couple of annoying sections, mainly involving the fire obstacle that you have to get through, which can insta-kill you. Yeah, that's a bit of a pain. Memories of Celceta has this swimming combat, which is terrible. I fucking hate it. The bump system in Dawn of East is dated, so that's worth a mention. And Memories of Celcetta's character designs, that when you compare it to Dawn, they are absolutely terrible. Like, what the hell did they do to Kana? What the hell? Like, why did they turn her from like this cool action girl into like this super happy, high energy chick? Like, I don't know. Like, it's just weird, but yeah, that's my issue with those two games. Issei, my biggest issue with Issei is the weapon upgrading is linear, the Dana sections suck, and the story's a bit messy in parts. I don't want to get into why, but my review might cover a little bit more, but yeah. And I'm not really a big fan of the way Beast Hunts work. I think that it's cool in concept, but I think that it's too complicated. I don't know, like it felt like a mini Muso, which sounds cool on paper, but I don't know, like I just couldn't get into it for some reason. Shadow Hearts Covenant is the next game, and the biggest problem with Shadow Hearts Covenant is the fact that the characters feel considerably less distinguished compared to that of the first game. And what I mean by this is that in Shadow Hearts Covenant, you can basically give magic to every single character. Like, they don't have like unique spells and stuff. You can give every character any spell you want, and there are only a few abilities unique to that character, and yeah, a lot of them are just damage dealing abilities, so it kind of makes them less distinguishable. Whereas in the first game you had characters like Keith who have moves that deal damage and heal himself, and you know, do all kinds of different things and lots of different utilities, and I really like that about Shadow Hearts 1. And Covenant kind of like made all the characters less interesting from a combat standpoint. That's not to say that the combat is worse, but it's just that the characters in battle are less interesting than the characters are in the first game. So yeah, that's my issue. Speaking of Covenant, the next game I want to talk about is Valkyrie Profile Covenant of the Plume, and the biggest problem with this game is the mission where you have to save Rosia, because that mission is an absolute pain in the ass, and if you play this game you know exactly why. The next game is Diablo 1, and the biggest problem with Diablo 1 is aside from magic there aren't any combat abilities to use, making playing a warrior or a rogue button mashy and therefore less interesting than playing a sorcerer, which yeah, you're basically just mashing buttons the whole game, and it doesn't really feel like it has much depth in the combat department, and that's the biggest problem with Diablo 1. Next up we have Urban Reign, and the biggest problem with Urban Reign is the controls. They're a bit difficult to get used to, I find. I mean, once you get the hang of it, it's not that bad, but they are a bit difficult to get used to nonetheless. And chaining combos on an enemy is difficult due to the fact that they tend to utilize the iframes, but you can do the same thing as well, so it is fair. But if you're looking to like combo an enemy to death, do bear in mind that they will get out of the combo due to iframes cheese, but you can do the same, so it is totally fair. Next I want to talk about the top 10 games. These are all the top 10 games, and the first one is Devil May Cry 3 in the Rolling Order as well. So the biggest problem with Devil May Cry 3 is the fact that the camera is awkward in some parts. Not all parts, but in some parts you can actually move the camera, and in those parts where you can move the camera, yeah, that's where it gets a bit awkward at times. But in the fixed camera sections, it's not a problem, it's just when you can move the camera. I don't know why they added sections where you can move the camera, because it just feels a bit inconsistent to me, and that's the biggest problem with Devil May Cry 3. That and the fact that on Dante Must Die, like, enemies have hit point sponges, and yeah, that can get a bit annoying at times as well. Next we have to talk about Pokemon Gold, Silver and Crystal. Like I said before with Pokemon Colosseum, the old school style turn-based, round-based system where the speed stat dictates the order of moves after you input commands. Same problem, so I might as well just mention it again. Kirby 64. Slow gameplay, everything moves at a snail's pace compared to other Kirby games, and the moveset flexibility is almost non-existent, especially when you compare it to Superstar, where you can actually do lots of different moves with each ability, whereas in this you can only like do one attack usually, or like if you have like the fire sword you can like move it up above your head and you can throw it, and you can also swing it as well, but other than that you can't really do much with it. Next we have Odin Sphere Lathrosir, and the biggest problem with Odin Sphere Lathrosir is the original game. The original game sucked, and if you played the original game it will never escape your mind with how fucking shit it was, and it kind of ruined my first time experience with the game because I played the original version. I was so pissed off with it that it kind of like soured my taste on the game as a whole. Even though Symphonia is like a better game in every single way, and I absolutely loved it, when I played the original game, I was fucking pissed off with it. It was so fucking frustrating that it soured me on the game. Even when I played Symphonia again, I couldn't take those horrible memories out of my head. But yeah, as for the problems with Symphonia itself, well, the shmup sections, I'm not a fan of. The ones that you do with Mercedes, I don't like those. And inventory management is still a bit of a bitch to deal with because you have all these bags and you have to like manage items with all the bags and stuff. It's not ideal, and I'm not the biggest fan of the inventory management. Next we have Mount & Blade Warband. Well, the biggest problem with this game is, well, I wouldn't say the biggest problem, but the graphics are pretty ugly. I'm just gonna put that out there. And the biggest problem is the fact that if you want to play as like a mercenary, there's not really much to do. Same like if you want to play as an arena gladiator, not so much to do. And the reason for this is the game focuses all of its efforts on warfare amongst factions. So if you're not participating in kingdom battles, there's not really that much you can do in this game. Like, it's very shallow. There are some things that you can do, don't get me wrong, but compared to like the kingdom battles, it is very much a more shallow experience. Just putting that out there. Like, you'll get missions that are just the same old missions time and time again, and that's ultimately the main thing that differentiates Mount & Blade from like other Western RPGs. The main draw is the kingdom battles, but it's worth mentioning nonetheless. Next we have Warcraft 3, and the biggest problem with Warcraft 3 is that it's an RTS. The RTS genre is fundamentally flawed. Like, I could make an entire video on this, and I did consider making an entire video on this. I think I might have mentioned it in one of my theory crafting videos briefly, but I forget. I mentioned it in my pacing video, I forget if I did, but basically, the RTS genre doesn't work. It never has worked, yet people like it for some reason. But the thing about it is, and the reason why it's fundamentally flawed is because, well, when you play a game that's in real time, and I mentioned this in the pacing video, when it's in real time, that real time becomes a currency, and that means that the real time aspect disrupts the strategic process in favor of dexterity. And that's a huge problem, because if you're trying to like manage all of this shit at once to like be time efficient, you're not being strategic because you're trying to be fast. And that's where the problem is, because if you're trying to be fast all the time, then you're not being strategic. I know you can have the argument of quick thinking, but really that's not the point. It's just that the game feels more like a game based on dexterity than strategy, just simply because there's just so much to manage at once, and yeah, the micromanagement becomes the name of the game above all else. As for the strategy, well, it's all basically meta. Just mass. That's basically usually the case in a lot of games, like just mass air. It's usually what works a lot of the time. Not all the time, but yeah, against most new players, it works. Just mass withers. But if you're up against high level players, probably not a good idea. Speaking about players, the community of Warcraft 3 is terrible. It has the worst community in gaming, except maybe Dota 2, but you've got to remember, Dota 2 originated from Dota, which originated from Warcraft 3, so yeah, League of Legends, Dota 2, every MOBA in existence, they all originated from this game. And notice how MOBA communities like Dota, League of Legends are all bad. This is why, because they originated from Warcraft 3. Like, the community in this game is horrendous, absolute trash community. Like, I can't even stress it enough. Like, if you've been there in the early days, you've seen shit. Like, the fucking revenge of the... I'm not even gonna say it because it's a freaking racial slur, but if you played Warcraft 3, you know the game. Yeah, this game has some questionable mods. I'm just putting that out there. And also Sylvanas is in it, and Sylvanas is one of the worst characters ever. I fucking hate Sylvanas. In fact, she's my least favourite character of all time, period. Fuck Sylvanas. The next game I want to talk about is Painkiller. Now, the biggest problem with Painkiller, and I mentioned it in my review, the boss fights. They mostly suck, and that's due to the fact that most of the boss fights are just some big puzzle boss, and that's about it. Like, there are some bosses, like, for example, the Necro Giant, which aren't that bad, but when you're fighting a boss like Swamp Thing, which you can't attack directly and you have to know how to actually damage it, yeah, that has no place in Painkiller. So yeah, that's the problem. Also, the final boss is very much like that. You have to figure out how to actually beat him. It's just not ideal to have boss fights like that, especially in Battle Out of Hell with like the Panzer Spider and the final boss just being absolute fucking shit because of the fucking bigness of them. The final boss fight of Battle Out of Hell requires that you hurt yourself while you're on a circle so that you have a chance to summon a fucking golem to punch King Alastor in the face so he's actually vulnerable and you can actually damage him. Why? Why did you do this? People Can Fly. Why? But yeah, that's the biggest problem with Painkiller. Now, the biggest problem with Grandia 2 is the fact that the game is too linear. Like, way too linear. You don't even have the opportunity to backtrack most of the time. Like, the game will basically just like lock out areas that you beat, and when you reach a new area you can't go back to an old area, and it does this all the time, and yeah, that kind of sucks. And there's not really much side content either. Like, there's like one optional area and it's basically just like an older area you've already been to but changed the enemies. That's about it. And the final problem with Grandia 2 is the fact that the game feels a bit too easy. Even on hard difficulty, it feels a bit too easy, and yeah, they could have added a very hard difficulty. I wouldn't be against that, but at least the game isn't frustrating, so that's one thing. I mean, I should also probably point out that it has some of the worst minigames ever, like arm wrestling and the nut grabbing minigame. They fucking suck. In fact, the nut grabbing minigame is so terrible that even Ryudo complains about the nut grabbing game, comparing it to a pillow gauntlet, because of how stupid it is. But it's also really tedious and really dumb. So yeah, that's my complaints about Grandia 2. F-Zero GX, well, as I say, like, the only problem with F-Zero GX is the difficulty, really. Like, the game is just way too hard by default. If you added an easy mode to story mode, it probably would be a perfect game, but because it's got this ridiculous difficulty, it can gatekeep some people. Like, not everybody has quick reflexes, and some people have disabilities. You gotta bear that in mind, and those people are going to struggle playing F-Zero GX on normal difficulty, so maybe they should have added an easy mode for those people. I mean, Grand Prix mode does have Novice, but story mode doesn't, and that's a huge problem. So if you want to experience the story of F-Zero GX without watching the cutscenes on YouTube, you basically have to be good at the game. Very good at the game, because the game is fucking brutally difficult, and that's the biggest problem with F-Zero GX. And finally, my favourite game of all time, Valkyrie Profile 2, and you'd think that I wouldn't have too many problems with this game, but believe me, I do. Like, the fact that this game is number 1 on the list is absolutely incredible, considering the fact that it has trapped treasure chests. Like, I swear to God, I fucking hate traps in video games. That's one of my kryptonites. I fucking despise them. Any game that has booby traps in them, I refuse to play them. But this game's an exception, and Infinite Discovery. Like, this game was so fucking good that I managed to get past it. And yeah, like, I fucking hate putting booby traps in games. Fuck that shit. It's just so cheap and annoying, and it fucking sucks. Like, fuck those games. Fucking hate them. The next thing that's wrong with Valkyrie Profile 2 is that Chapter 3 is usually where most people drop the game, because like the pacing of the story is a slog. I mean, it's fun if you like the gameplay and you're more of a gameplay driven guy. If you like good gameplay in JRPGs, you're gonna love Chapter 3 because it's all action and all gameplay. But if you want story, Chapter 3 doesn't really give you much story. You don't really get much story until after Chapter 3, and yeah, so because of that, it is a flaw that the narrative in Chapter 3 is not brilliant, let's put it that way. This is the game I was referring to when I was talking about Baton Kaitos with the narrative. Like, it takes a while to get into the narrative because of, like, Chapter 3 in this case. The next problem is mages are too underpowered, and this one upsets me a lot because my favourite character of all time, Lazar Beleth, is a mage, and he sucks in this game. He's not very good, but I still use him just simply because he's Lazard. Even though he's like the weakest character in my party, I still use him just simply because he's fucking Lazard. And I just throw him in there alongside all these overpowered characters just so that I can hear him do his crazy laugh whenever he gets break mode. so that you know just how unhinged he is. And the final issue with Valve Club Arc 2, actually there is one issue that I want to mention. It's a very specific issue, and that's right at the beginning of the game, there's an NPC that walks through a barrel. I'm not making this up, and it's a serious problem with the game. No, obviously it isn't. I'm joking, but yeah, like, the character walks through a barrel. They phase through a barrel. Like, they're walking, and then suddenly, like, this barrel shows up where they were walking, and it's just like, wait, did they just walk through a barrel? What the fuck? But yeah, that's just one thing I noticed about this game. Like, it's my favourite game of all time, so obviously I'm going to analyse it a lot and pick out the problems a lot. I love doing that with my favourite games. This is why I'm doing this video. And yeah, the final issue is some of the facial expressions. Like, Alicia, during that campsite scene, looks like she's possessed by demons. I don't know why, but she looks like she's possessed by the devil at one point in the game. And yeah, like, I don't know, like, some of the facial expressions just look weird to me. They haven't aged the best. I mean, the graphics in this game have aged phenomenally. It's just the faces that just look a bit weird. I suppose it's typical Tri-Ace because the characters kind of have this doll-like look to them, but I don't think it bothers me. It's just something that I should mention, like, as a little thing that people might complain about, on top of the fact that, you know, a lot of people tend to complain about the fact that there's no Einherjar cutscenes in this game, and that the Einherjar are like copy-pasted movesets and stuff, and reuse the same voice actors, you know, and all of that. But come on, it still has like backstory for each one of the Einherjar, dialogue from each one of the Einherjar in battle, where they interact with other Einherjar and shit, like all these little details that people that criticize this game like to ignore. That, and the fact that if you look into the development of this game, the Einherjar weren't actually originally planned for the game and were added in at the last minute. And the fact that they managed to put all that detail with the Einherjar and like have like a secondary story, like a side story to the game revolving around the Einherjar is pretty impressive. And Valve Club Arc 2 deserves credit for that. But anyways, I am done criticizing my favourite games now. So now I'm just going to praise my favourite games of all time forever and never say another bad thing about them because I love these games. And you should too. Well, you don't have to, but let's put it this way. I'd appreciate if you'd give some of these games a go because they are very dear to me. So yeah, but you don't have to. If you don't like what I say about the games, then you might not want to play them because they're not for everyone. And people have different tastes, so just bear that in mind. But if you do play them, let me know, so that I can basically hear your reaction to playing them, because I'd like to know about your experience with these games. But yeah, anyways, I'm done rambling, so see you guys.